My daughter's rich fiance refused to shake my hand. He said, "I only respect real money." I smiled and canceled the wedding venue. He had no idea I owned the entire resort. That happened on a Sunday afternoon in September at a waterfront resort on Lake Champlain in Vermont. The man standing across from me was 31 years old, wearing a watch that cost more than most people's cars, and looking at me with the specific expression of someone who had already decided that I was beneath him. He had decided this in approximately 45 seconds. He had shaken hands with my daughter's mother, with her aunt, with the resort general manager. When my turn came, he looked at my hand and then looked at me and said, "I only shake hands with people who have earned real respect." No offense. My daughter, Claire, was standing 3 feet away. She heard every word. She looked at me with the specific expression she had when she was waiting to see what I would do. I smiled. I said, "None taken, Brandon." I excused myself. I walked to the resort's administrative office on the ground floor of the main building, a room I knew very well because I had been in it dozens of times since I purchased this property in 2018. I sat at the desk. I made one call to my property management director. I said, "Pull up the Whitmore Harrington wedding booking for June 14th. I need to cancel it." She said, "The deposit is non-refundable, sir." I said, "Return it in full, today." She said, "Of course." I went back to the terrace where Brandon Whitmore was telling a story about his hedge fund to my daughter and her mother. He was still talking when the resort general manager came to the terrace with an apologetic expression and a printed cancellation notice, and told Brandon that, unfortunately, there had been a double booking error discovered in the system, and the resort would be unable to honor the June 14th reservation. Brandon went red. He said, "Do you know who I am? My family has stayed at this property every summer for 15 years. The manager said, "I understand, Mr. Whitmore, and I am deeply sorry. The booking has been fully refunded." Brandon said, "I want to speak to the owner right now. Get me the owner." The manager looked at me. I raised one finger. I said, "I can help with that." Brandon turned and looked at me. I said, "I am the owner." The terrace was very quiet. Claire was looking at me with an expression I had not seen since she was 16, and found out I had quietly paid off her school's art program when the district cut its funding, without telling anyone. Brandon Whitmore looked at the manager, then at me, then at his watch, as if the watch might offer some guidance about what to do next. It did not. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you are new here, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Every week, a new story. Let us get into this one from the very beginning. My name is Gerald Marsh, and I am 59 years old. I was born and raised in Burlington, Vermont. The specific Burlington that existed in the 1970s and early 1980s, a small city on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain that had a working-class heart underneath its college town surface, and that produced in me, from a very early age, the specific relationship with water and land and hard physical work that I would eventually build an empire on without anyone seeing it coming. My father, Leonard Marsh, worked for the city's Public Works Department for 28 years. He maintained roads and drainage systems and the specific infrastructure of a mid-sized New England city that most residents never thought about until something stopped working. He was good at his job in the quiet, competent way of someone for whom doing the job correctly was simply the standard rather than an aspiration. He was also a man who bought things. Not consumer things, land. Small parcels of land around Burlington and Chittenden County that he purchased whenever he had saved enough to make a modest down payment. Nothing dramatic. A quarter-acre lot here. A small parcel by a creek there. He bought these things in the 1970s and 1980s when they were cheap, and when nobody around him thought they were particularly valuable, and he paid for them slowly over time and he held them. He never sold any of them while he was working. He told me when I was about 12, sitting in his truck after we had driven out to look at one of the parcels, a sloped piece of land on the edge of Williston that he had bought for $11,000 in 1978. He told me, "Gerald, people think land is expensive. Land is the only thing they stopped making. When you have enough of everything else, you buy land." I did not fully understand this at 12. I understood it completely by 45. My mother, Rose Marsh, was a practical woman who ran our household with the specific efficiency of someone for whom waste was personally offensive. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small construction company in Burlington for 15 years, and she managed our family's finances with a precision that meant we lived within our income in a way that was genuinely comfortable rather than just technically solvent. She also had opinions about everything, and shared them at a volume and frequency that ensured nobody in our household forgot that she had them. I loved her for this completely. I was the middle of 3 children. My older brother Dennis was 4 years ahead of me and had my father's physical build and my mother's social confidence, and went into the trades at 18, plumbing, specifically, which he had been doing in the Burlington area for 40 years, and which had made him a comfortable living that he had never had any interest in expanding beyond comfort. My younger sister Paula was 3 years behind me, became a teacher, married a teacher, and built a life in Essex Junction that was the specific version of the Vermont life that most Vermonters aspired to: sustainable, community-rooted, genuinely happy in the understated New England way. I was the one who could not be satisfied with comfortable. Not because comfortable was wrong, because something in my specific makeup required growth as a condition of functioning. The specific restlessness of someone who looked at a situation and immediately started asking what it would take to make it 10 times larger. I understood this about myself before I understood what to do with it. High school was where I started to understand what to do with it. I got a job at 16 at a small landscape and grounds maintenance company in South Burlington called Green Valley Services. The owner, a man named Pete Anscombe, who was 50-something and who had been running this company for 20 years with a crew of 8, hired me as a general laborer, mowing, edging, hauling, the physical bottom of the landscape industry's labor hierarchy. I worked there for 3 summers. What I did with those 3 summers was what I had always done. I watched everything. The business, the clients, the pricing, the crew management, the specific gap between what the work cost to deliver and what clients paid for it. I watched how Pete estimated jobs and how often his estimates were right, and how often they were wrong and why they were wrong when they were. I watched which clients were profitable and which were not, and what made the difference. By my 3rd summer, I had a clearer picture of Pete Anscombe's business than Pete Anscombe had. I went to the University of Vermont in 1983 on a partial academic scholarship. I paid the rest through continued landscape work during summers and the specific financial management I had absorbed from watching my mother run the household. I studied business and real estate development. Not because I had a specific career plan, because those were the subjects that matched the restlessness, that described the language of the thing I could already feel myself building toward without being able to name it yet. I graduated in 1987, and then the real education started. Subscribe right now, because the next section is where everything gets real and where the first major failure arrives. Stay right here. My first business failed in 14 months. I want to say that plainly because the failure is the most important part of this section, and the honest version of how I built what I built requires it. The business was called Marsh Landscape and Property Services. I started it in 1988 with $7,000 saved from 4 years of college work, and a used truck I bought for $3,200 that ran, but only if you were specific about how you drove it. The concept was sound: residential and light commercial landscape maintenance and seasonal property services in the greater Burlington area. I had watched Pete Anscombe run this exact business for 3 summers. I knew the pricing. I knew the client types. I knew the crew structure. What I did not know was how to sell. Pete had 20 years of client relationships. His business ran on referrals from people who had been using Green Valley services since before I was born. I had skills and a truck and no relationships, and I significantly underestimated how long it took to build a client base from zero. By month 8, I was carrying the business on a credit card at 22% interest. By month 12, I was behind on truck payments. By month 14, I closed it. I sold the truck, paid off the debt, and sat in my apartment on North Winooski Avenue in Burlington with about $400 in checking and the specific feeling of a person who had tried their first real thing and found out exactly where their understanding was incomplete. I was 26 years old. My mother called. She said what happened. I told her everything. The clients I did not get, the cash flow I had not managed correctly, the sales capability I had discovered too late that I did not have. She was quiet. She said, "Okay, what did you learn?" I said, "I learned I can run the operations. I cannot sell the operations. Those are different skills and I need someone with the second one." She said, "So find that person." She did not say, "I am sorry." She did not say maybe this was not the right thing. She went straight to what came next because that was how she processed everything. I found that person in 1989. His name was Alan Foley. He was 34, a commercial real estate broker in Burlington who had been selling commercial properties and leases for 8 years, and who was very good at the relationship building and client development that I had discovered I was not good at. We met at a chamber event in Burlington and talked for 2 hours about the Vermont property market. He had the specific gift of making people feel like they were the most interesting conversation he had had that week. He also had genuine insight about the commercial property landscape in Vermont that was more comprehensive than anything I had encountered. I said, "Have you ever thought about going into property development?" He said, "All the time. I just do not have the operational and construction knowledge to execute." I said, "I have that." We went into business together in 1990. Marsh Foley Property Development started with one project, a small commercial building in Williston, Vermont, on a piece of land that my father had purchased in 1979 for $14,000, and that he sold to our partnership at its 1990 assessed value of $62,000 with a seller finance note because he believed in what we were doing and wanted to make it possible. That $62,000 parcel of land my father had bought for $14,000 became the foundation of a company that would eventually hold $300 million in real estate assets. I want you to understand that specific fact. A public works employee who made $46,000 a year in 1979 spent $14,000 of his savings on a piece of land that most people around him thought was an unremarkable investment. That piece of land started an empire because he understood that they stopped making land. The Williston project was a 6-unit commercial building for small business tenants, medical offices, a dental practice, a physical therapy clinic, a financial advisory firm. We delivered it in 1992, 9 months behind where we wanted to be because we hit subcontractor issues that we had not fully accounted for in the timeline. We learned from that. Every project after had more subcontractor redundancy built into the plan. The second project was a 12-unit mixed-use building in South Burlington. We delivered it on schedule in 1993. The third was a 30-unit apartment complex in Colchester. On schedule, under budget, fully leased within 45 days of completion. By 1996, Marsh Foley had completed 8 projects and had an annual revenue run rate of $4.2 million. Alan was selling the developments and the commercial leases with the specific effortless relationship skill that I had discovered I was missing in 1988. I was running the operational and construction side with the specific patient attention to execution that I had been building since I was a teenager watching Pete Anscombe's landscape cruise from the back of a mow line. We were genuinely complementary. We were also, by the late 1990s, building toward the thing that made everything else possible. Hospitality. Alan noticed it first. He said, "Gerald, Vermont's hospitality market is chronically underserved at the upper middle tier. The high-end properties are either truly luxury and inaccessible to most people, or they are dated properties running on the reputation of having been nice once in 1987. There is a gap." I said, "The gap between dated and luxury." He said, "The gap between dated and genuinely excellent, not luxury in the pretentious sense, excellent in the actual sense. Properties that are beautifully maintained, that deliver real service, that are in genuinely spectacular locations." I said, "Lake Champlain." He said, "Lake Champlain." We bought the first waterfront property on Lake Champlain in 2001. A 40-room inn that had been operating at 60% occupancy for a decade under owners who were ready to retire and who had not reinvested in the property meaningfully since the early 1990s. The bones were excellent. The location was exceptional. The operation was tired. We spent 18 months and $4 million on renovation. We reopened in 2003. Year 1 occupancy, 81%. Year 2, 87%. Year 3, 92% and a waitlist for peak summer weekends. The hospitality division became the most valuable part of what Alan and I built over the following 15 years. By 2018, the Marsh Foley Hospitality Group owned 7 waterfront and mountain properties across Vermont and upstate New York. The Lake Champlain Resort, the property that Brandon Whitmore would stand on in 2023 and refuse to shake my hand, was the flagship. I bought Alan out of the partnership in 2015 when he was ready to retire. A clean, fair transaction that we had been planning together for 3 years, and that we structured so that Alan's family was taken care of comprehensively, and that I retained the operating management. Alan and I remained close friends. He called me every 2 weeks. He had opinions about everything and shared them at a frequency that reminded me of my mother. I loved him for it. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the next section is where Claire enters the story, and where Brandon Whitmore enters the story, and where I tell you exactly what happened before the Sunday afternoon on the terrace. Stay right here. Claire was born in 1992. Her mother, Susan, and I had met in 1989 at a fundraiser in Burlington for a local arts organization that Susan had been volunteering with since college. She was 27. She was an elementary school teacher with the specific combination of patient attention and genuine warmth that those who went into elementary education because they actually loved it, and not just because it was a stable career. We were together for 6 years. We separated in 1995. I want to be honest about this because the honest version is the only useful one. We loved each other, and we were genuinely incompatible in a specific structural way. Susan needed presence. She needed the person she was building her life with to be genuinely available in the evenings and on weekends and during the holidays, to be home for dinner, to be the anchor of a family routine that was stable and predictable. I was building a company that was consuming the exact hours she needed me to be present in. Neither of us was wrong. We were just built for different things, and we had taken too long to understand that clearly. We separated without ugliness. We had Claire, and we understood that Claire was the organizing principle of everything that came after us as a couple. We made the specific adult decision that she would have 2 parents who were genuinely present, even if those parents were in different houses. I was present. Every Wednesday evening dinner and every other weekend and every school event and every birthday and every summer vacation and every moment that mattered. I was present not because the custody agreement required it, but because Claire was the realest thing in my life, and nothing I was building professionally came close to what she was. She grew up knowing both versions of me. The version who showed up for everything that mattered in her life, and the version who worked very long hours building something she could see was important to me, but that she understood from an early age was not more important than her. She was a good student in the way that students who were genuinely curious were good students, deeply engaged in the subjects that interested her, which were art and literature, and the specific intersection of the two that she eventually pursued at the Rhode Island School of Design. She graduated in 2014. She moved to New York in 2015 and built a career as a graphic designer at a studio in Brooklyn that worked primarily with publishing clients. She was excellent at her work. She was also, by 2021 when she was 29, in a relationship with Brandon Whitmore. I heard about Brandon before I met him. Claire mentioned him first in March of 2021 in a phone call that she made on a Sunday afternoon while she was walking through Prospect Park. She mentioned him the way she mentioned things she was still processing, briefly, in a context that communicated she was thinking about it but was not ready for a full conversation. She said, "I have been seeing someone." I said, "Okay." She said, "He is in finance. He grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut." I said, "Tell me about him when you are ready." She said, "I will." She told me more over the following months. Gradually, the way Claire told me most things in layers, adding detail as she got comfortable with it. Brandon Whitmore, 31, managed a small hedge fund in Manhattan that his grandfather had founded and that his father had run before handing partial management to Brandon at 28. The family had generational wealth in the specific concentrated sense of people for whom the wealth had always been there, and who therefore understood it as a baseline condition rather than as an achievement. I said, "Does he treat you well?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Does he make you feel like yourself or like a version of yourself he prefers?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Mostly myself." I filed that mostly. I met Brandon in person for the first time at a dinner in New York in January of 2022. He arrived in the specific assembled way of someone who understood that arrival was a statement. Good clothes, clearly expensive but not flashy, the specific calibration of someone who had been dressing for impression since prep school. He shook my hand at the restaurant. The handshake was correct. Firm, appropriate, the handshake of someone who had been taught that handshakes communicated character and who had practiced it accordingly. He was charming through dinner. Engaged, appropriately curious, asking the right questions about Vermont and about what I did and listening to the answers with the specific performed attentiveness of someone who had learned that appearing interested was important. He was good at the performance. I watched the performance. I also watched the moments between the performances. The specific fractional expression that appeared when Claire said something he thought was less sophisticated than what he preferred. The very subtle way he positioned himself as the more significant person in his own stories about the fund. The specific manner in which he talked about money, not crudely. He was too trained for crude, but with a frequency and a specific weight that communicated it was the primary measurement system. I said on the drive back to my hotel, on a call with Alan. I said, "He is good at the presentation." Alan said, "But..." I said, "But the presentation is the main thing. I am still looking for what is underneath it." Alan said, "Give it time." I gave it time. Over the following year, I saw Brandon at 4 more dinners, 2 weekend visits, and 1 trip to Vermont where Claire brought him to Burlington to see where she had grown up. He handled Vermont the way certain people handled places that were not their native environment. with a polite appreciation that communicated he was tolerating the experience rather than genuinely engaging with it. He told me over dinner in Burlington that Vermont was charming in the way that smaller places were charming. He said it with the specific warmth of someone paying a compliment that was simultaneously a diminishment. I looked at him. I said, "I have built most of what I have built in Vermont." He said, "Absolutely. And there is obviously a real market here for what you do." He moved on to another subject. Claire looked at her plate for a moment. I kept watching. The engagement announcement came in July of 2023. Claire called me on a Sunday morning. She said, "Dad, Brandon proposed last night." I said, "Tell me how you feel." She said, "Happy, nervous, both." I said, "What are you nervous about?" She was quiet. She said, "I think you know." I said, "Tell me anyway." She said, "He has very specific ideas about what things are supposed to look like, about status and money and who people are based on those things. I know you see it. I know you have been watching it." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you have not said anything." I said, "It was yours to figure out on your own. I will tell you what I see if you ask me, but I was waiting for you to be ready to ask." She said, "I am ready." I said, "He is intelligent and he has genuine qualities. He is also a man who has been measuring people by a financial hierarchy his entire life, and who treats people differently depending on where they sit on that hierarchy. That quality produces real problems in a marriage because you cannot build a life with someone who is always measuring." She said, "You think I should say no?" I said, "I think you should say yes or no based on whether you believe he can be a genuine partner, whether the measurement quality is the core of him, or whether it is something he can grow out of." She said, "I have been asking myself that question for 8 months." I said, "What is your answer?" She said, "I think there is more to him than the measurement. I think he learned it and I think he can unlearn it." I said, "Okay." She said, "You do not sound convinced." I said, "I am convinced of your assessment of him. I am watching to see if the assessment is right." She said, "So you will come to the engagement dinner?" I said, "I will come to everything. That is what I do." The engagement dinner was in September of 2023 at the Lake Champlain Resort. Claire had chosen it, not knowing I owned it. She had stayed there twice with friends and once with Susan and had always loved it. She had booked it through the resort's normal reservation process. She had no idea that the property whose terrace she was sitting on with her fiance and her parents had been purchased by her father in 2018. I had not told her, not as a secret, as a combination of privacy about my business and the specific philosophy I had always had about money, that it should be invisible until it needed to be visible, and that making it visible before it needed to be was a form of performance that I had never been interested in. It needed to be visible on a Sunday afternoon in September when a 31-year-old hedge fund manager looked at my outstretched hand and told me he only respected real money. Subscribe right now and stay right here, because the next section is where the terrace scene plays out in full and where everything that follows changes. Let me tell you what the terrace scene actually looked like from the inside. Not the dramatic movie version, the real version, which was quieter and more specific and more uncomfortable than any movie scene. We had finished lunch. The afternoon light was on the lake, and the water was doing the specific September thing it did on Lake Champlain, where the blue was deep and clear, and the mountains across in New York were the autumn version of themselves. It was genuinely beautiful, and even Brandon, who had the specific trained quality of someone who acknowledged beauty performatively, had said something genuine about the view when we sat down. The lunch itself had been fine. Susan was warm and engaging, and asked Brandon real questions about his work with the specific interested patience she brought to everything. Brandon answered with the polished version of himself that he deployed in social situations where he understood the performance was required. I had been mostly quiet. Brandon had made one comment during lunch that I had filed. Susan had mentioned my work, something about the Vermont property market, about how I had been watching it for decades. Brandon had said, regional property is a different world from institutional real estate, very relationship-driven, local knowledge-intensive, difficult to scale. He had said it neutrally, as an observation. But the specific way he had said regional property communicated the same thing that his Greenwich family had communicated when they said charming about smaller places. It was a category, a lower one. I had said yes. I had moved on. After lunch, Claire and Susan went inside to look at something in the main lobby. I was at the terrace railing looking at the lake. Brandon was nearby. I turned and extended my hand. Simple social motion, the normal close of a lunch. He looked at my hand. He said, "I appreciate it, Gerald, but I only shake hands with people who have earned real respect. No offense, just how I was raised." He smiled when he said it. That was the part that stayed with me. The smile. Not a mean smile. The specific smile of someone who believed he was being honest in a way that was admirable, who believed that his hierarchy was a value system rather than a limitation. I looked at him. I said, "None taken, Brandon." I smiled back. I excused myself. I walked through the main building at a normal pace. I said hello to 2 staff members by name. I went to the administrative office, which was past the concierge desk down a short hallway, and I closed the door. I called my property management director, a woman named Deborah who had been managing the operational side of the Lake Champlain property for 6 years. I said, "Deborah, I need you to pull the Whitmore Harrington booking. June 14th wedding. I need to cancel it." She said, "Sir, the deposit is $40,000 and the contract is non-refundable." I said, "Return the full deposit. Wire it today." She said, "You want to return a non-refundable $40,000 deposit?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I ask why?" I said, "Personal reasons." She said, "Of course, I will process it now." I said, "And send the notification to the general manager. I want him to deliver it personally to the guest." She said, "Understood." I went back to the terrace. Brandon was on his phone. 3 minutes later, the general manager, a man named Thomas who had been with the property since 2019 and who was the most composed professional I had encountered in the hospitality business in 30 years, came to the terrace with the specific careful expression of someone delivering unwelcome information. He said, "Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry to interrupt. I'm afraid I have some very unfortunate news." Brandon looked up from his phone. Thomas explained the situation. A double booking error discovered that afternoon. The June 14th date was unfortunately no longer available. The full deposit was being returned immediately. The resort would like to offer a complimentary future stay as an expression of apology. Brandon's face went through several things. He said, "Double booking error." Thomas said, "I understand this is extremely disappointing and I am deeply sorry." Brandon said, "This is a 40-person wedding reception. We have vendors contracted for June 14th. Thomas said, "I understand. The resort will do everything possible to assist in finding an alternative venue." Brandon said, "I want to speak to the owner of this property, right now." Thomas looked at me. I was standing 6 feet away. I raised one finger. I said, "I can help with that." Brandon turned. He said, "You." I said, "Me." The terrace was quiet. Claire and Susan had come back from inside. Claire was looking at me with the expression she had since she was a child when she was reading a situation that she did not yet fully understand. Brandon said, "You own this property." I said, "Since 2018, one of 7 waterfront and mountain properties in the Marsh Foley Hospitality Group." Brandon looked at the lake for a moment. He said, "You are in hospitality." I said, "I am in hospitality and commercial real estate and property development. Have been since 1990. He said, "You never said." I said, "You never asked." He looked at me. He said, "Gerald." I said, "Brandon, I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is more useful than the version of this, where we pretend nothing happened on this terrace 20 minutes ago." He said nothing. I said, "You looked at my hand and decided something about me. You made that decision based on what you could see. What you could see was a man in a practical jacket on a Sunday afternoon who had not performed his financial position for you in any way. You classified that man as someone below your threshold for basic courtesy." I looked at him steadily. I said, "You do this constantly. I have been watching you do it for 18 months. To restaurant staff, to service people, to anyone whose apparent position placed them below where you sit on the hierarchy you carry in your head." Claire was very still. Brandon said, "That is." I said, "Accurate. I am telling you it is accurate because I think you are capable of more than the measurement. I think Claire believes that too. She is the one who wants to marry you. She is the one who said she believed you could grow out of this." He said, "She said that." I said, "Yes." I looked at Claire. She met my eyes. I said, "The venue booking is canceled. That is real. Whether we rebook it is a separate conversation and it is not my primary concern right now." Brandon said, "What is your primary concern?" I said, "My daughter. She is going to be married to whoever she chooses to marry. I want the person she chooses to be someone who is capable of seeing people clearly. All people, not just the ones whose apparent position matches his expectations." I said, "You are not that person yet. You might become that person. That is the question she has been living with for 8 months." Brandon was quiet for a long time. He looked at the lake. He looked at Claire. He said, "Claire." She said, "Yes." He said, "Your father is right." She said, "I know." He said, "I did it without thinking. The handshake. I did it the same way I have done 100 things exactly like it was just the truth about the world." She said, "I know you did." He said, "That is the problem, that I did it without thinking." She said, "Yes." He looked at me. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry. And I mean that in the specific sense where I understand what I did and why it was wrong and not just in the sense of wanting to smooth this over." I looked at him. I said, "That is the right kind of sorry." He said, "Does the venue stay canceled?" I said, "That depends." He said, "On what?" I said, "On whether the next 6 months look like a man who is actually changing something or a man who is managing the impression that he is changing something. Those are different things and they produce different outcomes." He said, "How do I prove which one?" I said, "You will know, and I will know." Thomas was still on the terrace. I looked at him. I said, "Thomas, please reinstate the June 14th booking." Thomas said, "Of course, sir." He went inside. Brandon looked at me. I said, "Sunday dinners. When Claire invites me, I am at the table, and I am watching the same way I have been watching for 18 months. He said, "I understand." I said, "Good." I went to stand with Claire. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you owned this property?" I said, "Since 2018. She said, "And you never told me." I said, "You never asked." She looked at the lake. She said, "That is your answer to everything." I said, "It is accurate every time." She said, "Dad." I said yes. She said, "Are you okay with this? With him honestly?" I said, "I am okay with who you are choosing to believe he can become. Whether that person shows up is what comes next." She said, "And if he does?" I said, "Then I will be glad I did not get in your way." She looked at me with the expression she had since she was small when something had been settled. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Always." The 6 months between September and the June wedding were the most revealing 6 months of Brandon Whitmore's life. He did not know they were a test. That was the point. I want to tell you what I watched because what I watched is the most important part of what happened after the terrace. The first Sunday dinner was in October, Claire's apartment in Brooklyn. Brandon cooked. He had apparently told Claire that he wanted to handle the dinner himself, and he had spent 2 days figuring out what to make and had made a genuine effort that was visible in the quality of the result. He was not a skilled cook. The meal was imperfect and real in the way that meals were when someone was genuinely trying rather than performing. That told me something. The second thing I watched was how he spoke to the restaurant staff at a dinner in November that included Susan and her partner, and me and Alan and his wife. Brandon spoke to the waitstaff with the specific attention of someone who was actively correcting a habit rather than someone for whom the correction was natural yet. He was aware of himself in a way that was slightly effortful. But he was aware. He was trying. The third thing was a conversation he had with Alan. Alan had known about the terrace incident because I had called him the night of the engagement dinner and told him everything. Alan had the specific quality of a man who never forgot anything and who waited for the right moment to use what he remembered. At the November dinner, Alan had said to Brandon, "Gerald tells me you are in hedge fund management." Brandon said, "Yes, my grandfather started it. My father ran it for 20 years. Alan said, "So you inherited the position?" Brandon said, "Partially. I have brought in 3 new clients in the last year and restructured 2 existing funds." Alan said, "What did you have to do to get the 3 new clients?" Brandon said, "Earn their confidence in the strategy." Alan said, "And what did you have to do before they trusted the strategy?" Brandon said, "Make them trust me." Alan said, "And how did you do that?" Brandon said, "I showed up consistently. I called when I said I would call. I was honest about what the risks were and I was right about the opportunities." Alan looked at him. Alan said, "That is how Gerald built his businesses. Exactly that. He showed up consistently and he was honest about the risks and he was right about the opportunities. He just did it in Vermont in commercial real estate instead of in Manhattan in finance." Brandon was quiet for a moment. He said, "I understand what you are telling me." Alan said, "Good." That conversation cost Brandon something. You could see it cost him something. The measurement system he had been carrying was starting to recalibrate. It was not complete. A 20 or 30-year habit does not resolve in 6 months, but the recalibration was real, and it was producing visible results, and the visible results were the ones that mattered to me. He called me in February. He said, "Gerald, I would like to have a conversation, just us." I said, "Okay." We met for lunch in Burlington, his choice. He drove up from New York. He said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been thinking about September since September, about the handshake and about what you said on the terrace, about what your company is, about the specific fact that you built something worth several $100 million in Vermont in commercial real estate and hospitality without ever needing me or anyone like me to know about it." I said, "Yes." He said, "The measurement system I was taught, the way I was raised to assess people, it had a fundamental flaw that I never saw until September." I said, "What flaw?" He said, "It only measured what was visible. It measured what people chose to display, and you chose to display nothing. which meant my system assessed you as nothing, when the reality was the opposite. I said yes. He said, and what that means is that my system was not measuring people. It was measuring people's willingness to perform their position. Those are completely different things. I said, yes, they are. He said, your father bought $14,000 parcels of land in Vermont in 1979. I said, yes. He said, because he understood that land was the one thing they stopped making. I said, yes. He said, nobody in my family would have bought that land. They would have assessed it and found it beneath their attention. I said, probably. He said, and that parcel started what you built. I said, yes. He was quiet. He said, I am going to marry your daughter. I said, yes. He said, and I want to understand something. Is this enough? What I am doing, the changing, is it enough for you? I said, I am not the person you need to convince. He said, I know, but I want to know what you see. I looked at him. I said, I see a man who is working on something real. I see someone who is paying attention in a way he was not paying attention in September. Whether that continues past the comfort of this period is what tells the story. He said, you are going to be watching. I said, always. He said, I know. He said, I think that is actually good. The wedding was on June 14th. The Lake Champlain Resort was perfect in the specific way that it was always perfect in June. The water calm and blue, the mountains across the lake, the terrace where 5 months earlier a man had looked at my hand and made a decision about me, now set with white tablecloths and flowers and 40 people who loved Claire. I walked Claire down the aisle. She was in a dress she had designed herself. Of course she had. She was exactly herself. That was the best thing. At the reception, Brandon gave a toast. He said, Claire's father has built more than anyone I knew before I met him. He built it quietly, in a state most people in my world thought of as charming in the way smaller places were charming. He taught me something I should have understood 30 years ago. What people are worth has nothing to do with what they choose to show you. It has to do with what they choose to build. He looked at me. He said, thank you, Gerald. I raised my glass. I did not say anything. Some moments were better received in silence. I want to say one thing clearly before I let you go. The canceled booking was never about punishing Brandon. I want to be honest about the motivation, because the honest motivation is different from the dramatic one. Brandon refused my handshake and walked away believing he had correctly assessed someone beneath him. If I had not owned the property, I would have found another moment, a different situation, some other point at which the specific blindness of his measurement system would have been visible in a way that required him to look at it directly. The resort was just the tool that was available on that particular Sunday. What I was actually doing was giving my daughter the conversation she had been circling for 8 months. The conversation about whether the man she wanted to marry was capable of the growth she believed he was capable of. She believed he was. I needed him to show her he was. That required him to be wrong about something significant in a way he could not manage around. And then it required him to respond to being wrong in the way that told you whether someone was genuinely growing or just managing the impression of growth. He responded the right way. Not perfectly, not immediately, over months in the specific daily choices that built into something that had changed him in a real way rather than a performed way. My father bought land that nobody else wanted to buy. He did it because he understood that value was not always visible in the present, that the most significant things were often the things that looked the least significant until enough time passed and enough patience was applied. Brandon's grandfather started a hedge fund with other people's money in Greenwich, Connecticut. My father bought a $14,000 parcel in Williston, Vermont. Both are real stories. The difference is that One required you to already have money to make more money, and the other required you to see value that nobody else was looking at yet. I was raised by the second story. I built from the second story. And I raised a daughter who had the specific intelligence to see past the performance of the first story to the person underneath it. She was right about what was underneath it. She was the one who took the real risk. The engagement, the conversation with me in September, the patience she extended through the 6 months between the terrace and the wedding. She took all of that on the specific faith that her assessment of who Brandon could become was accurate. That is a harder thing than canceling a venue booking. That is the hardest thing. She was right. That is the ending. Hit that like button if this story stayed with you. Subscribe to this channel and do it now. New story every week and everyone is worth the time. Drop a comment and tell me what you took from this one. Tell me about a moment someone underestimated you and what happened when the truth came out. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every comment, every one. Thank you for being here.